Hi and welcome to this little class about science communication. As I said in my little intro where I presented myself, I want to show you how I present research to talk about outreach and communication of research to people. I've been working with it for over 20 years, but I have to say that one of the first time I really started thinking about what am I doing and what on earth am I trying to give to people and show to people was at a conference when this guy came over to me. Now, he's a really famous ice core scientist. He's a professor at Princeton, and he looks like a real nerd, doesn't he? And we were always a little bit scary of him. So we were in a group of students, and he came over and stood and talked to us, and he looked at me and said, "What do you do? I'd like to come to your poster. Tell me what you do." And I realized that I had no training in this. I've been to a lot of conferences, and I walked around and looked at poster sessions. And often you walk along those aisles and the posters are hung up nicely. And I pass a poster by a US student and they turn around often and say, well, there might be some Americans in the class, but you know that because you trained since like first grade in schools to do this. They often turn around and look at me and say, do you want to have a look at my poster? Do you want me to present my research to you? I never learned this in Norwegian school, but I realized that if I really wanted this famous guy to come and look at my research and get engaged in it, I have to, in a very short time, maybe just in a minute, be able to tell him what I'm doing. What we're often facing then is this moment in an elevator. Let's say you go into an elevator with the most famous person you know in your field, and you know that elevator ride is like 30 to 40 seconds. And the person turns around and asks, so what do you do? What do you work with? I have a project coming up. Do you want to work with it? I'm interested in what you're doing. And you realize that you have that moment. You know, the thing is, you can actually train on it. And if we've been in Bergen together now, and I had a whole room filled of you, you're all going to turn to one another, look each other in the eye, and explain to one another what you were doing and how you're going to commit to collaborate together. Sometimes we call this speed dating. That's also one way to communicate research, to sit down and create almost like an artificial environment where you go from table to table and present yourself. The point of it is that you get more and more relaxed and you get more and more or better and better to presenting your research. There are many groups that we want to disseminate our research to. Peer-to-peer is the most common. We go to conferences, we go to workshops, and we present to other researchers. Maybe if we're really lucky and have a paper that triggers interest, maybe mass media are interested in us, journalists, newspapers, TV, they want to do an interview with us so we can present our research. Maybe also our research is interesting for the educational sector, like schools and teachers. That's one of my favorite groups to do dissemination for. But then we also want our research to count, to matter. We want politicians in society to use knowledge, that a lot of the decisions in society we make today should be based on research and new knowledge. So dissemination to policymakers is also very important. Sometimes we have to think and we have to reflect and maybe be conscious because maybe we cannot communicate on all these platforms. Sometimes it's important as the researcher to find your own voice. Why do you want to disseminate? And also, who is it that you want to disseminate to? And try to work out some, in a way, guidelines for yourself on how you want to do that. Very often, we end up in front of large auditoriums. Now, this is daunting. Even as a teacher. My students often ask, you seem a little bit nervous when you go in front of us, even if it's a Monday at 10 o'clock and you met us 20 times before. But the truth is, I'm always nervous in front of an audience. And it's not a nervousness that sort of make me stop talking or lame or I can't find my voice, but I'm eager. I want to present good. I want my message to come true. And I take my audience seriously. And because of that, I'm always a little bit nervous. But to be in front of a huge room, maybe at an international conferences, is really special. Now, in my next talk, I want to talk a little bit about what I do to get into these rooms and what I do to make me relax a little bit more. This is maybe more kind of familiar to be in a smaller group, maybe in a workshop or in a seminar. The room is smaller. We are familiar with the settings. Maybe we know the people from before. Maybe these are researchers and colleagues and students that we met before. This is a safer environment, an environment where it's much more easy to interact with the people in the room. And it's also easier for the people in the room to ask questions and integrate. We are closer and we get this face-to-face connection. I go a lot to schools. And trust me, to come into a schoolroom with 6th graders that thinks that, finally they're not going to have their teachers all day. There's a scientist coming, maybe in a lab coat, maybe to do an experiment or tell something exciting about the Earth. And you realize that you only have a very narrow attention span with these kids. After a few minutes, they want some action. They want to hear what's going on. So this is a whole new arena to communicate to schools. But trust me, it is very fun and it is very rewarding. And maybe you are placing a small seed into a kid that will be the next in your field that you meet 20 years from now. And they'll come to you and say, I remember when you were in my classroom. That was really what made me continue at school and go on to study and do research. But research dissemination, I think, personally, should be an integrated part of what we do at the university. We have a lot and strong focus on our research and the research output. And this is also often how we get evaluated as scientists. What's your H index? How many citations do you have? What's your points in Google Scholar? And of course, more and more, thankfully, we're also putting a lot of effort on good quality education. This is also now something that we see in how we're being evaluated. It's important to be a good educator. It's important to spend time building a good relation between the students. And new words have come in. Student active learning is something that we have in schools today. But where is the dissemination? Which part of outreach does that play in the university? Well, dissemination is bridging the relationship between research, researchers, the research institutions, and the outside world community. We have to start going out of campus to communicate. So the way many institutions, the way many universities and research environments are looking upon outreach now is that it's one of the 3 core activities that should happen at the university. And these activities should be very closely integrated. But why should we do it? And why do we do it? Well, I want to start explaining that with maybe coming up with 5 barriers for why we don't do research communication. Well, a lot of my colleagues tell me, why do you spend time on this? Why do you go to schools and give talks? Why do you go to energy companies and talk about the climate? Why do you vaguely try to talk to the politicians to get the message through that we have to do something about the climate? Because is it really meriting me? I'm an associate professor now. The fact that I give a lot of outreach, is that going to help me become a professor? Well, doubtful. I don't think so, unless we see that outreach indeed is an integrated part of what we do. We also see that dissemination traditionally gives very little prestige among colleagues, at least. You're on your own again. You're given a TV interview or in the newspaper. Nobody really cares about it. Maybe your neighbors, or at least my mother, she loves when I'm in the paper saying, wow, you did a good job there on TV. You looked good. But maybe your colleagues, are they jealous? Do they feel uncomfortable about it? Do they feel maybe that you said something about a field that they know perhaps a little bit more about? Well, it's either you do it because they don't do it. So you have to think about how and why we should present research out to the community. We also know that perhaps this is not making us make money. I mean, when we apply for money to the research councils or to EU or other financial institutions, does the fact that we're also doing outreach, does that give us more research money? I want to talk to you a little bit that That is starting to become more and more important. But a lot of people at universities are saying, I do not have time. And also, we are also bound by tradition. It's not traditionally the way scientists work. We're always thinking about this lonely guy in a white lab coat in a corner, at least in my field, in a corner office that doesn't really communicate with society. But this is not how science is anymore. Science is free of boundaries. Science is international teams. Science is traditions that are completely changing from when I was a student to now that I'm conducting research. And outreach is more and more a part of what we do. But what on earth can a university do to get the researcher to do something she had not thought to do, not even have time to do, and are not even being rewarded for doing? And if we've been here now, and you all been in the room with me, I would have asked you, do you want to do research or not? Every year, there's somebody who says, I don't want to do outreach. I don't feel it's for me, and I don't think it should be what scientists are doing. I'm going to give you some good tips for why you should do it. Why should we get motivated to spend time on research outreach, for instance, in media? Well, there is research on it showing that if people read about your research in media, a lot of the audiences, and not just the fellow scientists or people that are curious or are in the research field, but lay people out in society, they want to go back to the original source. They want to read your paper. And there is proof that more people are going back and downloading your research material. So that means that you get a lot of clicks. That means that people are interested in your research. So instead of being a well-kept secret, only published in a journal and maybe just downloaded by some of your closest colleagues or people that are going to cite your research, more people will actually read a research article. That means that more people in society will understand the scientific method. More people will understand how your results are coming, and they will maybe also get curious on research. So there's really a lot of good research evidence showing that if you put your research out there, your research is going to count more. Well, money is always a driver, isn't it? And what we see now is that every funding institution is putting dissemination. You have to have a clear dissemination plan. Now, this is from a research funding that I got a couple of years ago. And what we get feedback back from the reviewers, right? So the application is sent out to panels, and they get feedback on everything about the team, about your plan, or your hypothesis, your methods, and gender balance. That's also new since I started studying. It really matters now, and dissemination matters. And this dissemination plan very clearly said that the dissemination is outstanding. It stretches across a number of explicitly described stakeholders, representations, levels of expertise, and types of impact, and is exceptionally convincing. I worked really hard on that outreach plan. What I did was describing really clearly which stakeholders we wanted to communicate to. One of them is, of course, peers to peers in conferences, seminars, workshops, and scientific publications. But I also suggested I was going to have a tour at the public libraries to communicate about how ocean and climate work together. So I traveled all around in the county of Hordaland, visiting 18 libraries and giving talks. I also wanted specifically to communicate to schools, so I invited high schools to come and visit our laboratory and work with us on our research data. And of course, I wanted our research to count in huge decisions for the world. So it was also our goal that our research should be quoted and cited by the IPCC, the climate panel of the United Nations. So it was a very thought-through plan, and we got the grade 7, and it was thankfully that top grade helped us to get financing. And we know today that this is happening in all financial institutions. So from a researcher's point of view, why should we do it? Well, if we look at this word cloud here, science is important, communication is important, we get to meet the public, maybe we can write, we have an audience. There's a lot of scientific ways of thinking of doing outreach. But if you view outreach from a 12-year-old's point of view that just had a bunch of students or maybe PhDs and researchers visiting, they think that what we're doing is amazing. They think that we are interesting, that we are involved, we're actually cool, that we're fantastic and brilliant. You know, when you've been through something like that and been in a classroom and gotten feedback and worked with young people, it's extremely rewarding. That's also why I love to lecture a lot, because the interaction between me and the audience gives me a lot of energy. And every time I do it, I think I become just a little bit better, because you get feedback on what you do, and especially kids are merciless. Hey, I don't understand that. Explain that a different way. Why are you using that word? What does that word mean? How do you do that? And you have to explain it. And you know that when you explain something, at least in my field, in geology, like we have a lot of methods, we have a lot of processes. And the more simple everyday words you can use to describe an advanced geological event or process, the better I understand it in my head. And strangely enough, the more I talk about it and the easier I understand it, the better I am also at writing it down, making clearer ideas, clearer hypotheses, and hopefully also clearer papers. But there is one way you can become famous in our field, especially in my field, and that is to become a fossil. The important thing to become a fossil is that you have to really choose where you're being buried. You have to choose an anoxic environment that doesn't break you down. You have to also be found. And provincially, you should be made of bones so that your bones are captured. But of course, there are other superstars in sciences besides becoming a fossil. One of them is Sir Richard Attenberg, who many of us have seen on TV programs over and over. I mean, my favorite is, of course, The Blue Planet and the oceans. And sometimes we have a choice on who we want to be when it comes to science communication and outreach. Very often we end up being the main person because you've written a paper, media picks it up, or maybe a press person at the university have sent out a press release, and you become the main person in focus. Maybe with a newspaper interview or a TV interview, you are the researcher, you are the knowledge search. Another role you can sometimes get is being the helper of media and journalists. I sometimes get called up if a colleague of mine abroad or in Norway has published a paper. And maybe I've had another publication with an opposing view, or maybe they just want to have, a comment on the research. What do you think of the research? Has this really broadened the field or moved the field? So then you can help the journalist to write a better story by giving quotes or insight into the science. Well, sometimes you are also an expert. I guess Richard Attenberg is one of those experts. He's in the borderline between being the expert and the entertainer, because obviously he's a brilliant scientist, but he's also incredibly good in disseminating and explaining everything in nature to us. But there are agencies, IPCC being one of them, but also governments or local politicians that need an expert, that need science expertise to explain, for instance, why we need better public transport in a city. For instance, why we need to think differently about our emissions of climate gases. Here, the scientists can go in and help society. And of course, some of us maybe end up being like entertainers on TV. Now, there's a lot of quiz programs that might need an expert scientist to find out if the panels are answering right and wrong. Now, these are, of course, just some examples of the roles that we can be and the roles that we can take within outreach. Meeting journalists and media, a lot of scientists are telling me very often that they never want to go in a newspaper. They never want to be interviewed because those journalists, they just take my story and twist it around. And besides, how can I take my 30-page research article and they want me to give a 2-minute explanation on TV or just a half a page in a newspaper? Thankfully, I've had really, really good experiences with journalists. Remember in the little film that I had presenting myself, that I had a paper that came out and I met a lot of journalists that helped me make my science clear, that helped me shape my nerdy natural sciences thinking into something that was important for society. So I had good experiences with journalists, but there might be some guiding lines when it comes to working with them. First of all, it's good that you sit down beforehand and try to write down some of the main points that you think is important that should be in the story, in the news story. You might often start asking a question. Maybe you can't really present your entire research hypothesis, but why did you do it? It's got to be in a way curiosity driven. What were you trying to find out, and what have you come up with, and why is it important? These are very important for journalists to get through. And they also want to sell a story. And the way I see working with journalists is we both help each other to write a story. The journalist is going to put his or her name on it. And of course they want to look good. They want a story to sell. And you as a scientist, you want your story to be clear. You don't want to lose any of the context. But trust me, you have to give up a lot. You have to be less specific. You have to, one thing, for instance, in climate research, we're always saying, well, the sea level by the end of the next century can increase somewhere between 30 to 80 centimeters. And there's a lot of uncertainty involved, and it's very important that people understand this uncertainty. That doesn't go well in media. You have to actually be more tabloid. And being tabloid means that the audience who are reading it are getting curious, they're getting knowledge, but maybe your colleagues in the corridor think you're a little simple. You simplified it too much. But this is the give and take of working with journalists and working with media. And you always have to remember that you can always ask for the text. And all the journalists that I work with, they're always sending me their manuscript. So I can check the quotes, so I can see if what I've written or what I participated on makes sense. Journalists are actually not dangerous at all. I think journalists are really, really good friends of science because they want to make sure that the people out there are getting knowledge and are getting enlightened. Another way to disseminate your research is through the popular science article. In it, you're the lead role. You are the main author. And it's very often, I look upon the popular science article a way of making raw material into gold. Because again, when you're really writing good about your science, people get curious on what else you've done. So you get a lot more clicks, you get a lot more attention for your research. The popular science article answers 4 questions. First of all, what have you found out? What are the most important results, the most important conclusions you come up with? How did you come up with this? Did you do experiments? Did you do polls? Did you do stuff in the lab? What practical implications can this have? What advice can you give on the basis of research? And first and foremost, why is it interesting? So you have to really get through why your research is interesting, why you like it, and what you have to provide. Don't read this. This is way too much text. My point of this is just the front page of a journal. This is a kind of papers that we download. And what's happening in more and more journals now, so whether you like to write popular sciences or not, if you want to get your paper published these days, you have to write a summary in plain language. Now, we're all familiar with the scientific abstract. That's maybe one of the hardest things you do with a scientific paper. In the end, you sit down and you write the abstract, because it's the abstract that might trigger people to download it, cite it, and read it. But now the journalists are specifically asking us to summarize our research in plain language, or in a language that could be sent straight out in the media. And a lot of journals are doing that. They're using social media and they're putting these plain language summaries out there as a clickbait, so that media houses or journalists might pick it up and might want to make a story about it. This is a difficult thing to do, but once we start doing it just within the research field, this might be an integrated part of what we are doing for the future. So this is the end of this little short session where I showed you some examples of various platforms for outreach and communication. In the next little movie, I'm going to give you some tricks of the trade and some points that I used in outreach. Thank you.